What's up guys, welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. I'm your host Caleb. Today we're talking about the top 5 most powerful commanders you could be building on a budget right now. And hey, maybe you want an extra $15 to help you build these budget commanders? Well, you can click on that whatnot link in the description down below. You get a free $15 and it helps out the channel. Another thing that really helps out the channel is liking, commenting, and subscribing, and I really appreciate all of you that do that. Last but not least, let's shout out those patrons. Irrelevant, you rock. Let's get right into it. The first card we're going to talk about is Taewa at number 5. This girl's pretty underrated and has strong abilities that allow her to control the board state while getting card advantage. Now, her first ability is pretty simple. It says whenever we deal non-combat damage to a creature, as long as it's equal to our toughness, we get to draw a card, right? So if we deal 1 damage to a 1/1, we get some card advantage. 2 damage to a 1/1, no card advantage. And then her next ability, also pretty useful. It says we can pump X and then or tap her and then pump X into that ability, and then whenever we deal non-combat damage, it deals that much damage plus X. So we shove 3 mana into this ability, then lightning bolt someone, and they're taking 6 damage. Again, really powerful and really cool abilities that allow us to control the board, especially when we're using effects like Electrickery. This says deal 1 damage to each opponent's creature, right? As long as we overload it. Well, whenever we pump a ton into her X ability, this just wipes all of our opponent's boards. Not to mention, if you play against a lot of token decks, you can even just overload this, deal 1 damage to all of their 1/1s, draw a ton of cards, and catapult yourself ahead of your opponents. The trick to this deck is we're running a ton of Electrickery effects. They're just 1 mana costed cards that deal 1 damage to a creature, and then Taewa is the toolbox that we're going to use to buff that damage up to remove their key pieces while getting card advantage. We can also include cards like Stormkiln Artist so we never run out of mana, and if you want to get a little bit tricky with it, there's some infinite combos we can use using Blazing Sunsteel and stuff like Brash Taunter, right? You deal 1 damage to Brash Taunter, you get to draw a card, and if it's equipped with Blazing Sunsteel, we can deal another 1 damage to Brash Taunter, drawing us another card, and you can draw your entire deck this way. Eventually, we will have to kill Taewa, that way we don't deck ourselves out, but again, we get infinite damage off of this and can draw our entire library. So it's something worth including in the deck if you want to bump it up on power level. Other cards of note with Taewa is stuff like Mana Geyser. Just being able to add 15 mana to your mana pool pretty consistently on turn 5 is not okay in this deck, especially when we can use that mana to then cast our cantrips. So you don't have to spend all 15 mana on Taewa ability. Maybe you just spend 10 of it on Taewa ability, and then you cast 3 spells that deal 1 damage. That's going to be pretty brutal, and then later in the game, you do just pump all of that mana into Taewa, and you can get it to where you're pretty comfortably dealing 20 plus damage with these spells that deal 1 damage to your opponent. Kind of busted. What I also like about Taewa is if you want to upgrade her, it's very easy to. You know, you add your breach strategies, your wheel strategies in there. You can even throw in Jessica's will, and now you're adding even more mana. She's got a very clear upgrade plan if you really like the playstyle of the deck. Moving on to number 4, we have Loot. This guy just incentivizes you to build decks differently, and he's super powerful at the same time. He allows us to exile the top X cards of our library equal to the amount of different permanent types we have on the battlefield, not including himself. So artifacts, creatures, enchantments, planeswalkers. Again, this is where it incentivizes you to search out cards that you normally don't put in your deck. Because let's be honest, we get complacent. We just shove Farseek in a deck because we're used to putting it in there at that ramp slot. Now we have to look for cards like Utopia Sprawl. That way we can get more loot triggers. And it just ends up playing a lot differently than the decks you already own because you have to include a lot of different cards you're not used to playing. And not to mention, we've gotten a ton of exile support in this past year, like Dark Arlok, Sage of the Beyond. That one might not be too new, but it's still very useful here. And then stuff like Party Thrasher. Now we're able to actually cast those cards from exile, which is the biggest problem with this deck. Great problem to have, right? We're actually getting too much card advantage here, and we need to ramp out fast. That way we're actually able to cast the spells we're exiling. Again, amazing problem to have. We can also seamlessly add in Paco and Haldan. Amazing cards here. I love Paco Haldan. They're kind of a pet deck to me, but additionally, it just has a lot of synergy here. Whenever you cast one, you get to find the other one. Maybe you exile Paco and you're not able to cast it, but you just have to be, or you have to learn to be okay with those interactions. Whenever you're playing a deck like this, sometimes you're going to exile one of your cards and you're not going to be able to play it that game. That's okay, go to the next game, maybe we get it done that time, right? I think people have to be more okay with exiling their cards in the name of card advantage, but that's, something else. Another thing that this deck really gets to abuse is other commanders that benefit off of playing stuff from exile. Like Faldorn allows us to get those 2/2 wolves, we can play Ixra to get a massive army as well. Even the Lost and the Damned is going to be an amazing card here just to get, again, bodies off of playing our deck. Now whenever we're doing anything, we just get extra value, and that's just going to add to the power and consistency of this commander. Before we move on to number 3, I did just want to mention that I haven't fully fleshed out all of these decks. I've built some of them, and the ones that I've built I'll leave in the description down below, but this is where you guys come in. Sound off in the comments which one of these you really want me to fully flesh out, and I'll make sure to build it for you guys. Now we can move on to number 3 with Marneus Calgar. This guy has double strike, he's a 3/5, and he says whenever a token enters the battlefield under our control, we get to draw a card. He also has an ability, we can shove 6 mana into him and create 2 tokens. Notably, it's whenever 1 or more tokens enters the battlefield, so we will only get 1 card off of generating a ton of tokens. Where this guy really gets broken though is with the investigate mechanic, because investigate just works differently. Let's talk about Tivit for a second. Let's say we attack, everybody gives us a treasure. That's going to draw us 1 card. Now let's say we attack and everybody gives me a clue. So that's 2 clues from me and 3 clues from our opponent. We're going to actually draw 5 cards off of Marneus Calgar, because clues work differently. You're not creating a clue, you're investigating. And investigating is a trigger that has to go on the stack. 9 times out of 10, it just gets shortcutted and they're like, okay, you generated 5 clues. But that's not what actually happens. What actually happens is the investigate trigger goes on the stack and then you draw a card. Which, why do we care, right? We care because Marneus Calgar sees those as separate instances of tokens entering the battlefield. So we get to draw 5 cards off of Marneus Calgar. And that's where this deck is going to lean. We also got a ton of clue support this year. With Piper Wright, this is going to make our Marneus Calgar massive. Forensics Gadgeteer is going to reduce the cost it takes for us to sacrifice those clues to draw cards. And then Officious Interrogation is just going to cause us to investigate a ton, netting us a ton of clues and a lot of card advantage from our commander. Not to mention we can run stuff like Inspiring Statuary, so now our clues can tap for mana essentially. And then all we have to do to close out the game is slam something like a Cyberdrive Awakener, or maybe just cast Rise and Shine to animate all of those clues, and now they can smash face. Overall, this is just going to be a unique take on Marneus Calgar that you can build on a budget, and the deck's just going to work. Ranking in at number 2, we have Cutel, just because of how flexible this girl is. You can take her the enchantment route, include stuff like Elevere, put a lot of auras in there, include cards that generate creatures whenever you cast enchantment spells, include cards that let you draw cards whenever you cast enchantment spells, and then you're left with a super budget, very efficient deck that generates creatures, draws a ton of cards, and just allows you to draw even more cards off of your commander whenever you're smashing face. Very flexible and, again, very efficient. The other route you could take her is the 1/1 counter route, and this is the one I favored just because you can use the adapt mechanic, which we've gotten a lot of this past year, and there's a lot of flexibility we can have just by putting 1/1 counters on our creatures. Now whenever we put 1/1 counters on our creatures, we can return cards from our graveyard, we can generate a bigger board state with stuff like Basking Broodscale, and then this is a deck that you almost have to power down to make it not too degenerate, because all you need to do is accidentally include something like Rosy Cotton and Basking Broodscale in the same deck, and then boom, you've generated infinite creatures and infinite colorless mana. So again, it's something you have to watch. I tried to only include one of the 2 pieces, right? If I'm going to include Ivy Lane Denizen, I'm not going to include Herd Baloth because boom, those 2 just go infinite way too easily. And then we're including stuff like Mikaeus, that way we can tap it and put a 1/1 counter on an entire board. That way our entire board is triggering Cutel, drawing us even more cards, and these creatures just get massive super quickly, and it's a super efficient strategy. I'm also a huge fan of the Outlast mechanic in this deck, because now all of our creatures with 1/1 counters on them have abilities such as lifelink and flying. Again, super efficient and super free. Another thing that's super efficient and free in this deck is anthems. Slam 1 anthem on the battlefield and boom, all of your creatures are now able to trigger Cutel. This just ended up being a solid deck that goes wide, smashes face, and draws a ton of cards. Not to mention, it's super easy to upgrade. I do actually own this deck in paper, I just haven't posted it to the channel yet because I wasn't sure if if Selesnya 1/1 counters was interesting enough for you guys, so let me know if you want me to post that or not in the comments down below. Moving on to the number 1 deck and most powerful budget list you could be playing, it's Corum the Undertaker. I've recently built a budget list that has every single card under $1, so you can literally get this list for like 35 bucks, and it has impressed me. Even the feedback I've gotten from other players when they're playing against it, they can't even tell that it's really a budget deck. So let's get into the overall goal of this deck. We're trying to mill everybody to an oblivion with stuff like Mind Rack Harpy. That way we can fill everybody's graveyard with creatures, because the main goal of this deck is to get a creature in our graveyard that has its power based off the amount of creatures in everybody's graveyard. So now Corum's just going to get massive. We also paired this with a life gain strategy that honestly surprised me and ended up being pretty busted. When we include stuff like the glowing one, we're gaining so much life we can actually take aggro from all of our opponents, take a ton of damage, and then still end up on top somehow, just because of the amount of cards we're milling and the rate we're milling them out. Another thing that's really cool is when you play cards that people don't really know about, like One Ring to Rule Them All. This mills everybody to an oblivion, fills up the graveyard, gets a ton of creatures in the graveyard, and then makes Corum massive. We're also playing other stuff like Blade Wing, that way we can benefit off of creature cards in our graveyard as well, and generate an instant board state out of nowhere. Again, there's just a lot of very powerful budget cards in Jund people don't really explore, and this commander abuses them to the fullest while giving us a ton of advantage, right? Another thing that just adds to the consistency and power of this deck overall is Corum's interaction with our Buried Alive and Lively Dirge effects. Whenever we throw those creatures directly into the graveyard from our library, we're actually able to cast them with Corum, turning all of our Entomb effects into effective tutors that get us the exact cards we need at the exact time we need. But how does this deck win overall? Well, you've got the obvious commander damage, or you can just wait until our life gain strategies pay off. We gain a ton of life, we mill everybody to an oblivion, and then we cast Command the Dreadhorde. Pay a ton of life, reanimate all of our opponent's broken creatures, all of our broken creatures, and then attack and win the game. Because we're also playing stuff like Chainer that allows us to give all of the creatures we reanimate haste. So that's going to do it for this top 5, guys. Let me know if you want to hear about any other top 5s in the comments down below. Really enjoy doing these videos. I hope this helped you in your deck building endeavors. Let's shout out those patrons: Irrelevant, Chicken Salad, Excessum, Creator, and The Professional Heal. I hope this helped you guys in your deck building endeavors, and I will see you all in the next one.